Hello, my name's Joe Guadagno. I am from Phoenix, Arizona. I am a senior director for a mortgage company in the States, as well as the vice chairperson on the .NET Foundation Board of Directors. My contact information, I'll bring it up. My Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, my website, the jjg.me/about. There'll be a couple of links in here. All start with jjg.me. It's basically a URL shortener. So if you want, you can take pictures. The sample repo is also going to be on that GitHub link, as well as some YouTube videos of things I've done similar to this. So the agenda, we're going to first start with getting started with dev containers. Then we're going to talk about what a dev container actually is. Then we're going to build some containers. Then we'll customize them. Then we'll kind of walk through how you use them in Visual Studio Code. Then we'll play around with a container within a container, or basically two containers together in one project. And then we're going to show you an example of how you can use this to open up your project on GitHub without needing anything on your local desktop outside of some form of internet browser. So getting started, why do we need dev containers? Well, it's one reason, right? Most developers say, works on my machine. Docker and containers tries to solve that problem of getting everything localized into one piece of hardware or software so that you don't have to worry about the configuration going across the board. So to get started, you need two different things basically. Docker Desktop for the Mac or OS, or Docker CE/EE for Linux. Now, depending on the version of Windows you have, you might need a WSL1 or WSL2, depending on the version. Same thing with Linux, depending on which version of Linux kind of tweaks the version of Docker. But if you have a working Docker instance on your device, then you can use this. The other thing you need is Visual Studio Code. Although rumor has it, it works with JetBrains Rider 2. I just haven't tried it enough to demo it here. And then you need an extension from the Visual Studio Code store called Dev Containers. If you got started in this really early, which was like 6 months ago, it was called Remote Containers, but it has since been renamed to Dev Containers. So if you go through docs, you might not see a lot that says Dev Containers. A lot of it still says Remote Containers, but it's only been around for like 6 months or so. So let's build some containers. Before we build the containers, let's figure out why we need to do that. So this is your typical environment. You have your inner needs here. Let's get the highlighter going. This is your development machine, right? You need things like the operating system, shared libraries. That runs across all your needs, from development all the way to deployment. But when you're working locally or on your build servers, you only need things like your compilers, your SDKs, build tools, those kinds of utilities like MS Build and so on. But locally, you probably only need your debuggers, the operating system utilities, things like Beyond Compare, etc., and then whatever personalization. So we're going to kind of show you how Dev Containers helps with this, where you can go from very beginning with nothing on your machine to have a fully fledged dev environment, with being able to port that over from one machine to the next without having to install anything outside of those initial three that we talked about. But before we get started, this is kind of like the breakout of what dev containers are. They all start with a template. So if you're familiar with Docker, this is basically your image. There's a little bit more to that, but this is basically an image. And I'll show you some examples of what templates are in a minute. So you have your templates, and then templates on top of that goes through a feature set. And the feature set are usually your compilers, your build tools. So in the case of a .NET example, we have a Windows box or a Linux box with the .NET SDK. Then we throw features on it like MS Build and so on. And then the developer container kind of wraps that and adds personalizations to it. How many people here use Visual Studio Code? I would imagine most of us do. One of the good things about Visual Studio Code is that you can personalize it. You can add your own extensions and plugins. And what you'll see in the very vanilla example we start off with, I'm going to have no extensions, but the next one I'm going to add 2 extensions. And we go to see the final sample, which is my blog. There's like 7 or 8 different samples. And that's what the developer container is. It takes a template, adds features on top, then adds all your customizations. So templates, there are about 100 some odd templates, and new ones are being added every other day. Things like Alpine images, Debian images, C#, F#, C# with MS SQL, etc. And I'll show you a link. The link at the bottom, Dev Containers Features, has a long list of them. And then features, I want to say there's like 1,000 some odd features. Things like the AWS command line, the Azure command line, .NET command line, Git, Hugo, PowerShell, SC or ZSH, you name it, there's probably a feature for it. So let's go and take a look at those features. That's enough for PowerPoint for now. And slideshow. And go to Edge. I use Microsoft Edge. I hope I don't get kicked out of the conference as a result. I'm not a Chromebook guy or Chrome fanboy anymore. So this is the plugin. If you go to the Marketplace Visual Studio and search for Dev Connections or do it from your browser, gives you a couple examples for it. But these are the templates. Let's reject all cookies. Now you'll notice in the maintainer column right now, most of it says Dev Container Spec Maintainers. That's basically the 6 or 7 people that are in charge of the repo at Microsoft that build this. But you will see that there are others down here, like there's this R project that they maintain it, and then a whole bunch that are no longer maintained, which is funny because it's only like 6 months old. And then you'll see others. So you can understand who the source is. The ones that are listed as the dev container spec, those are the ones that Microsoft has built, trusted, validated the images, and so on. So it's just a word of caution. If you click on any one of these, it takes you directly to the Git repo. So like if I go here to the C# one, it's going to take me to everything that's part of it. Now, you really don't need to know anything about this. It's helpful to know if you're using the containers to see what they're built with. So that's where this dev container comes in, and I'll show you that in a little bit. And if you look at the features have a lot too. Now you see you can keep scrolling this list. Common utilities is something that you'll see a lot of in almost every one of these images. There's Docker, there's Git, there's Git large file support. You name it, there's probably something in here. There's PHP, there's Node, NPM, Jekyll, you name it, there's a plugin for it. And the best thing about it is you can add your own. It's just a source. So let's go see how we can do that. So I'm going to pop open Visual Studio Code, and I'm in a directory that has absolutely nothing in it. So as you see, it's literally empty. If I go to the Explorer and go to projects where I opened it at, where are you? See, I'm in presentations right now. Close you. There we go. Projects. I had it open before. Containers. So we're going to be working on this directory, container demo, and then container demo SQL. So right now there's nothing. So I want to build a development environment for .NET. Let's say I don't have .NET 6 on my machine or .NET 7. I do, but let's just say I don't. So I'm going to come here and open up the command palette, which is Control-Shift-P on a Windows machine or Command-Shift-P on a Mac. And then I am going to not do that again. I am going to choose dev containers, and there's a bunch of different options if I go to dev containers. I have add new dev container configuration, clone, etc. Most of the times you're going to use add dev container files or clone repository and container volume, and then every once in a while a rebuild and reopen. So I do that. First thing it does is say, hey, what configuration file do you want to use? This is the feature, or this is the template. So which template do I want to use? If I see similar to the website, I can scroll down and see hundreds of them. The difference is this one's in alphabetical order. The website's kind of just how they're listed in the Git repo. So I'm going to choose C# for now, hit enter, and then it's going to want to know which version of .NET I want. Most of the times you can choose default for all the options. The only exception is, as you'll see in the next one, we're going to choose a different image, whether you're on a Windows machine or a Mac machine. And that's really the difference here. Bullseye or Jammy. Jammy is a certain Ubuntu image where the default and Bullseye work for everything else. So I'm going to click enter to choose the default. Then it gives me the option to add features. So what features do I want to have available in this? So a couple of things I like to choose are common utilities, and then the ZSH plugins. And then I want to make sure that I have the Git command line available. So I'm going to choose that. Click OK. And then I can keep defaults or configure options. Now the options vary depending on what the plugins you choose. So I'm going to choose keep defaults. Now one thing to keep in mind, I'm using 2 community plugins, actually only one in this case, the community utilities. The first time you choose a community led device, you're going to get a prompt saying, hey, this is coming from a source outside of Microsoft. Do you trust it? Similar to what you would get if you had a NuGet package from an untrusted source. So ignore the configuration file for a minute. We're going to kind of see that in the next. Next thing we're going to do is build a container. So we do dev containers, and then you can do rebuild and reopen, which I'm going to do, or reopen in container. Since this is the first time it's going to be built, need to do that. So what's going to happen behind the scenes is Visual Studio Code is reading that page or reading that config file, which I'm going to explain after this, and then generate a Docker image. So if I look here, we see starting dev container show. It's going through and basically created a Docker Compose file behind the scenes and ran Docker start, loading the volume. Then it's going to create a workspace that allows me to connect to local drives, or you can actually do it to create a container in here, which is one of the other samples. So once this is done, we should get a, hey, you're complete. Right now, you'll notice here, I have a new kind of blue box that says dev container C#. That means I'm connected to a remote container, right now the C# one. You can create them any different name you want. We'll see that in a future example. And as soon as it's built, we'll get a dialog box that says so. It might be taking an extra minute because of the internet connection in here. Come on. Let's make sure Docker is running. Yes, Docker is running. Just hasn't finished building it. While that's building, let's take a look at the dev container file. This is basically a JSON file that lists out everything I've talked about. So there's a name. This name doesn't really mean anything for as far as the build is concerned or the container, but it kind of points to what you see here. By default, it takes on whatever the template name is. As you'll see in one of my examples, I rename it to my blog because I demonstrate it using my blog. Then whatever image it's using. So if you remember, I got to choose what version of .NET. It basically filled in this part of the image with it. So the template said, get me mcr.microsoft.com/devcontainers.net-0- and then the 7.0 is what I added in. The features are those 3 features that I added. So you can basically go to this URL and copy this text here and manually create that file for you. You don't have to do it through the drop-down list. So this basically goes through and maps one-to-one with that. And then these couple other things we're going to talk about in the next version. Why is it not open? Let me see. For some reason, it didn't run that step. Let me create a terminal and see if I'm actually in there and just, yeah. So it apparently didn't feel like saying it was done. So now I'm in a terminal inside of this dev container. If I do a list, you'll see there's nothing. Essentially, Visual Studio Code is creating a mapping from a Docker volume onto my local machine. So let's go and create a .NET app. So I'm going to do .NET new -- name and hello dev containers. And what did I get wrong? .NET new console. So now there's a folder here which has the hello dev containers. And now if I go back to that file folder, now you see I have the dev containers and the hello dev container. So it mapped to my machine locally. There's also a way you can do it where you don't need anything on your machine, and I'll show you that in a little bit. So now if I navigate to that folder, hello dev containers, and then do a .NET build, it'll build, and then a .NET run. And there I go. So I officially met my speaking criteria. I did my first Hello World demo for the year, and I am good to go. So let's go see how I can take that to another step. So I'm going to go and graciously, actually before we do that, let's show that you can actually do debugging in here. So I'm going to do a console.writeLine hello Oslo, and then console.writeLine hello NDC, and then I'm going to put a breakpoint right here, and then I'll choose the run and debug. And then a couple of seconds after it builds. Oh, come on. Stop being so finicky. Just making sure it can build. I didn't have any errors in there. There it goes. Now you see in a couple of seconds, I wrote the hello world and I got the full breakpoint like I would normally. So that's a basic console hello world app. Let's take a look at building something a little bit different and going through a web app. So in order to save time, I'm just going to delete these and we'll create a new web app in here. Let's go to this window. So I'm going to do .NET new web -- name hello containers web. hello name.net new web. What was that? Oh, yeah, yeah. Thank you. That directory doesn't exist anymore. So now I'm creating an empty project, and if I hit play, or let's just do a cd and .NET run. cd hello. Looks like I broke the terminal. Let me kill the terminal, add a new one, cd hello .NET run. One of the things you'll notice with this, with an ASP.NET Core app, there's going to be ports that are needed to run, usually 7,000 or something. And I had a little port highlight here, which tells me that there are open ports. So by default, it realized that port 5001 was needed, so it opened it. Now if I click open in browser, I get my Hello World app. So that's cool. Another basic example or starting example. Let's go and take a look at the next one. So this one, we're going to start with a SQL Server instance. So I'm going to do dev containers, add new configuration file, and do C#, and I'm going to choose C# and SQL. Same thing here, choose C#7, and then let's do those common utilities again, and SCH. I click OK. I'm going to keep the defaults. Now this one's going to take a little bit more than a minute as soon as I click reopen in container, because now it's going to create two. What you'll notice with this one is there were more files there. This one had a lot more files to it that we'll see once it's done building. This one's also going to error out. There's a new quote-unquote feature with SQL Server and ADO.NET that requires a new connection string parameter called encrypt equals true and or trust server certificate. And this library is not synced up with that yet. So that's why we're getting a bunch of errors here. So we'll fix that in a second. So let's go and explain what these are. So we kind of talked about like the name. I can change this name here to MS SQL NDC, and then below here when I rebuild, see that? But now there's a Docker Compose file and not a bunch of images. The reason for that is because we're building a SQL Server that needs different parameters. So if I go here and it points to Docker Compose.yaml, let's go take a look at that Docker Compose. You'll see this looks like a typical Docker Compose file. There's an app section which says build it using Docker file. That's going to build our .NET side of it with ASP.NET Core, etc. And it's going to create a volume called workspaces. And that workspaces is going to map to the local directory. Then there's going to be a db command. This uses SQL Server latest. If you're on a Mac, this will not work out of the box. You have to change this to MS SQL / Azure SQL. It's basically an emulator for Azure SQL services that runs on a Mac because this image does not support the Mac M1 chips. And then Docker restart if needed. Then there's an environment. Obviously, you'd want to pull this from a secret server or something like that. But since this is only running locally, it doesn't really matter. And I'm going to delete this demo afterwards anyway. And then the accept EULA, which is part of the Microsoft SQL. You also notice something here. It says add forward ports 1433 to dev container to force MS SQL locally. So if I want to access this SQL Server from any other tool, like I'm going to open up JetBrains Data Grip in a second to show you how to connect. So let's go back to the JSON file. So we didn't add any features to it because it's taking the default from that image. But now there's this customizations. So this customizations will get mapped to something. Here it's customizations VS Code. So what this is saying is for the app VS Code, I want you to add the following settings. So it's going to add a series of MS SQL.connections, which basically has the connection to the local server on port 1433 using SQL login, SA, that same password we had in the config. And then we're going to call it MS container. Let's just call it MS container NDC so we can see. And like I was mentioning before, there is a known problem in this where the port names or the SQL code does not line up. So I'm going to just copy and paste that so we don't have to see it. This fixes the temporary problem with ADO.NET and SQL Server. Trusted server certificate. Why are you complaining is true? Oh, because that should be true like that. Now, there's also an extensions here. Again, this is for the Visual Studio Code. It's saying, hey, when you build this in Visual Studio Code, I want you to automatically include these two extensions. So this is the Microsoft.NET Tools C#, which is this little guy here, and then the Microsoft SQL Server command library, so I can have access to the SQL Server. And because I know I'm going to want to forward ports, let's go and uncomment out this. And I got to add a little comma here, otherwise it's going to complain. And tell it that I am going to want 1433 also to be open. And apparently I don't need to do that. I need to put the comma afterwards. The last thing that's on here is the post create. So the post create happens after the Docker image is built and loaded. This is basically, think of it like the auto exec back or your startup. As soon as the image is ready and it's created, it's going to run this. So for the example of MS SQL, it's going to run these three files here. Basically install the SQL Server tools and then run this setup, which basically creates a sample database for you. So you can modify this code to build out whatever database you would need the first time. So create database, whatever permissions, tables, lookup data, etc. And then this is not needed for most cases, but you can change the default user. If you have services that are running inside your ASP.NET app that need to run under a certain context, you can save it. So if I got everything right with the configuration, I can do Control Shift B. Come on. Control Shift B, and then rebuild. So dev containers rebuild. So now this will do is going to go and create those instances. So let's pull up that and we'll see it running through. It should also run through the success of building out the SQL database, and then I should be able to connect to them afterwards. And I got an error here saying the database already existed, which is good because I ran this twice already. So if I close this, you notice right here, I got the little hourglass. It's Visual Studio Code opening up inside of the container and downloading the two plugins. So it just downloaded the SQL Server plugin and the database projects plugins. Those are the extensions that I asked it to load right here. So if I come to this one, because I already have the connection settings saved here, it's going to pre-populate with those connections. So I should be able to do that and type in my password the one time, which was You also notice a little prompt. I typed in the wrong password. Can't tell you how many times I typed in that password. Oh, it's because I literally typed in the wrong password. PASSW0RD. And now it's connected and I'm inside that. And because I opened up the port, you'll see here I have 3 ports opened up. I have 1433 and I have 5000 and 5002. Those are assuming are going to go to the instance of Visual Studio. Now you notice here it said 5001, but it's maps to local address 5002. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to why? It realized that that port's already in use because I never closed the other instance here of the dev container. So this one still has port 5001 open. So it's smart enough to know that I already had that port and it mapped it. So if I close this and rebuilt the container, it would have 5001, 5002. So now if I open up, let's say Data Grip, because I don't have the Microsoft SQL tools on here, in about 10 seconds, I should be able to connect to it. So let's go and connect, close. I'm going to go add new data source and I'm going to choose SQL Server. And then localhost, username SA, and then PASSORD, and then application DB, and test the connection. I should get a green. Man, I really can't type that password. I had to come up with a better password. PASSWD. Yeah, I typed it right that time. So I click OK, and now I have access to it. So I can use local tools that might not be available. So if I had like Visual Studio and there was something extra I needed that was not available in the container, I can still do it there. And since it's a web app, or since this is just a database piece to it, I can still go to a terminal and then ultimately create a new instance, a new website, and work with it. But I wanted to show what it looks like inside of SQL Server, since this is mostly a .NET group. Next thing I'm going to do is kind of show, like, as you have this and you check it into your repo, if you're checking in something into GitHub, you can use Codespaces with this that allow you to work with it without having anything installed on your machine. So right now, my blog is done with a tool called Jekyll. Jekyll is a Ruby-based tool that basically will create a static website. And that's what all this is. It's just a bunch of stuff to get Jekyll working. So I look at my dev container here. It's going to be slightly different. And it's slightly different for a couple of different reasons. Let's go to full screen, which is one of these buttons somewhere here. Let me zoom in. Is that readable in the back? Okay. So here I have it named, my name of my website, josephguadagno.net. Here I'm using a Jekyll 1 bullseye, so it's running on the default box, which is a Linux box. I didn't add any features to it. I forwarded port 4000 because Jekyll requires port 4000 for its development. I could have did a post create. So what happens typically in post create with this is you want to do a bundle update or a bundle install. Because I'm using a default Jekyll image, I don't need that. There's also a post start command that every time the engine starts, it can do something. And a lot of times in local development, for in this case Jekyll, you would do a bundle exec Jekyll serve to start your web app. But I don't want to do that. I want to actually start it myself because sometimes I make changes. Here you see I'm adding 6 different plugins: a markdown plugin, a markdown linter to make sure my markdown's cool, and then the ability to add emojis, because what's a good blog without emojis, right? And then because I really, really suck at spelling, a code checker that will check my spelling, as well as a preview for GitHub styles, and then GitHub Copilot, which I use a lot. Now, I'm also using another feature which I didn't talk about yet, which is called the container environment. This allows you to pass in any environment variables. So if like you're connecting to a remote SQL server, but you don't want your passwords in code, you can create environment variables the same way that you could in Docker with a .env file, or using the $, and then the environment. And you can change that up here under settings. I'm going to zoom out a little bit because it's harder to find that way. And then here under, it's under settings down here, settings and secrets. I would click on Codespaces to show those secrets. Now I'm not going to show that because this is being recorded and I don't want to have to change my GitHub token. But basically in this section is where you can create all of your settings. So now when I have this, if I go to the code tab, see this code button. Normally you would click on it and you'd be under local, where you can copy and open it in Visual Studio Code or desktop. There's also this Codespace tab. So what I'm going to do is create a Codespace on main. So what's happening behind the scenes is GitHub is going to spin up a virtual machine that's going to run Visual Studio Code and everything that was in that container file. So it's going to make a copy of all the files. It's going to do a git pull, and it's going to add in all those extensions. And about 10 seconds or so, you should see extensions pop up here. Now, the only difference between this version of Visual Studio Code and like the one on my desktop is I'm not signed into this one, so you don't see all my customizations. But if I signed into this one, it would pull in all the customizations I had in Visual Studio Code. Now you see it's setting it up, and here's my blog. I get a message here saying, welcome to GitHub, welcome to Codespaces. You're using a pre-built Codespace defined by the pre-built configuration. So you probably noticed that built really fast. And it built really fast because I pre-built this, knowing that I am working on Jekyll or a certain image. I told GitHub to kind of pre-download that image and have a server on standby, although it's not on standby, so it knows all the definition and basically spins it up instantly for me. And I'll show you where to do that in a second. Since this is on Git, I'm going to do a git pull to make sure I have the latest and greatest, which I was missing a file. And that's because this has been cached with the build I built a while ago. So I had to do a git pull to pull everything down. But it's the first time you're running it, you don't have a cached server, you don't necessarily need to do the git pull. And then just to make sure I have all the right plugins installed, I'm going to do a bundle install with this, which updated 1 or 2. And then for my site, I'm going to do a bundle exec Jekyll run. And in about 25 seconds or so, you'll see port number. Oh, it's not run, it's serve. You see a port number highlighted here. This was the port number 4000. It's building the site. It usually takes about 30-ish seconds, and then it'll pop up in a window. One of the things I didn't show you before is look at the URL. Look at the URL that's on here. Guadagno, which is my GitHub username, and then probable disco. So the Dev Connections toolkit has a random word generator. So it pairs 2 words together, and that's the name for your image. So this one turned up probable disco. Every time you rebuild it, you get something different. So if I look at like Docker here and zoom in a bit, you'll see that the recent one I created was Interesting Hoover. And my current website that I have running locally is Sharp Lamport. There's no name. You can't go and change that yet. It's kind of annoying if you're running multiple images, but just something to be aware of. And this is still running. Let me zoom out so I can make sure there's no errors. Nope, still generating the feeds. Oh, it generated them. So if I click here, do control click, it's going to open up. Now the only difference with this from a normal URL is because this is running in a hosted service, it's not really on port 4000. So GitHub does some magic. This is again the Guadagno probable disco, whatever the virtual machine name is, -4000. So it says, okay, pretend you're on 4000. It takes that 4000 behind the scenes, converts it so that it's usable here, and then the app gets. So now I have my blog working locally, and I can test it and validate that it's actually working. So let's go and do that just to show we're doing, let me zoom out altogether. Let's go here and pick a latest blog post. So the most recent one is way at the bottom. Actually, where is the mostly? Should be a 2023. Oh, look at it, I'm already in pages. Let's just grab 2022, 10, what have you. So I'm going to go and edit this one and say hello from NDC, just to show it's no smoke and mirrors. This is the Visual Studio file list order, which is this one. That's what it says. Now I'm going to go here and commit changes. Or actually I'm not going to commit changes. I'm just going to, I'm just going to save the changes. I don't want to edit it directly in there. That's a bad way of doing it. Let me go back to here and do it, because if I do it the other way, it's going to actually commit it to the repo, and I don't want to do that. I just want to test to see if it works. So let's find that 2022, 10, and say hello NDC, and hit save. And then down here you'll see it's generating a new feed for the post, and 10 seconds or so it should pop up with the new one. And when it does, I'm going to click here and hit refresh, and when it does, it's still generating. Come on, any day now. So I need to put a faster VM when I'm doing the demos, so it's almost instant. There it goes. Now it's done. I hit refresh, and now we have the hello NDC in there. So I was able to modify the code right here in the browser. Nothing up my sleeves. That's why I wear a short sleeve shirt today. So you can see that I can modify pages online, which is great, because if you're on a cell phone and have to make a quick spelling error change, you can do it with relative ease. I'm going to go and undo that commit, so I have the full ability that I would in VS Code, and discard it. And you can see I have the GitHub plugin, which is one of the ones I added in, and you should see a spell checking in here, although I don't really have any spelling errors here. So that is dev containers in a nutshell. Let's get up to the next part of the slide deck. Swap displays. So these are some of the common settings that you're going to deal with. Almost always name, features, forwarding ports most of the time, customizations, post create and post start. I covered the post create in the SQL Server example. I did not cover post start, but that's basically as soon as the container starts, every time it starts, it's going to run this command. So whatever that command is, basically it should be a batch file if you're going to be or a bash file if you're going to be doing Linux containers. So remember, now that we have dev containers, works on my machine, it's a DevOps problem now. It's no longer your problem because you got it working um, in the container. That being said, open it up to any questions. Yes, sir, in the back.
How do you connect with your database when you're running Codespaces?
How do you connect to your database when you're running Codespaces? Assuming your database is not inside the container, right?
Yes, the question is when the database is running in the container.
Oh, you can connect to it just like you would. I pulled up a example before with data grip. As long as you have the ports exposed, you can use any tool because it'll pretend like it's locally on your machine. So in this particular case, I connected to port 1433, which is the instance of SQL Server is running on port 1433. What was that?
Local host or?
Yes, localhost. Yes, localhost or dot, depending on your database server. Gentleman right there.
You listed the Docker Desktop as a requirement at the beginning. Does it mean it does not work with Rancher Desktop, for example, or will any other Docker engine?
Any other Docker engine will work. I only listed Docker Desktop because up until 2 weeks ago, I didn't try it in Rancher, but it does work in Rancher. Anything that uses the Docker exe will work. So Rancher Desktop works. Yes, sir.
When running the database in the container, does it persist the data on the host, or is it copying?
So the question was, when running the database locally, does it persist it in the container? The answer is it depends. And the reason why it depends is how you set up the container. So if we look here in the example, nope, not that one.
Possible to map it using volumes?
Yes, exactly. So in this one, there is I think it's this one. In this one, we have or not this one, the other one. Come on, Joe. Oh, I think I closed it. I closed it. I didn't delete it, but I closed it. In this one, we have a Docker YAML file here, the Docker Compose. We can add a volume here to persist the data and persist it locally. The difference is with that, it works locally on your machine, but if another engineer in your group pulls it down, they're going to have their own copy of data. So you have to look and see, how you can share that volume if it's critical. But anything that's critical in between should be something that's in your script when you create the environment altogether, like lookup tables and that kind of stuff. Guy in the back.
You mentioned GitHub Codespace caching the image. Are you going to show that?
Oh, yes. The question was, I mentioned GitHub is caching the images. So if I go to the repo, which is this one. So in the repo, no, that's not that one. In the repo here, actually I close it because I have the code window open. So if I go to GitHub, so there's two different ways you can do it. From here, you can go this ... here. Let me zoom in to do it, or I can hit plus. There's also a settings here under Codespaces where you can set up a pre-build. So right now this is my pre-build. You see I ran it 4 weeks ago and it's available in 4 different regions. So depending on where in the world I am, I get one that's close to me. So when you set up a pre-built, you can get a list of different things that you want to do. What branch do you want it? You can do it on main or maybe a CI/CD build or engineering build. When do you want the pre-build to trigger? In this case, every time I push. So every time I push, it gets a new build. And then what I want to use. So it's going to use that dev container file to figure out what it needs and then keep that image cached so that anytime I come back to it, it's ready to go. The pre-build is not, there's no cost to it from my understanding. Using the actual container and Codespaces, there's a cost to. But I think you can have up to like 4 or 5 pre-built containers. Any others? Yes, sir.
Can I set up own features?
Can you set up what features?
You know, you have said want to use a C# or a Git or a common tools.
Yep.
So when I'm in an enterprise, I have my own tools.
Yeah. So with those, the question was, can I set up kind of like my own tools and features? If they don't exist on the site, what you end up having to do is making them part of the repository and then pulling them in from there. Or if you have your own Artifactory or JFrog or something like that, you can pull them in from there. Unless you want to create them in the public Git repo, which I doubt you want to do for dev containers.
And this is your repository, right?
Yep.
And you have here you have shown it because it's here recorded your settings for the code space.
Oh, this is a public one. The only thing I didn't show was my environment variables.
Okay. When I'm now in a team and I want to share these environment, so everybody use these environment variables. So
You can do that in one of two ways. You can do the .env file, or you can literally show it right here. So if I pull another one of my repos out, I can show you that's not using it. So if you have environment variables for things like a SQL Server connection or a user ID password for something, under settings, you can go to secrets and variables, pick Codespaces, and then just do new repository secret, and that's key value pair, just like you would in your environment variable or a bash file or something like that. So I can do SA password and then 1, 2, 3, 4. See if I can type the other password now. Yeah, because now there's no pressure. I can type it. So there's that. Yes, sir.
You demonstrate your first created container from .NET 7, and then you can container from SQL. Could you just sequentially just start with one set of features and then upgrade?
You can. Essentially, the question was, I started off with .NET 7, then I did not .NET 7 with SQL. Can I like eventually upgrade? You can. You're just basically rebuilding the container. So you're going to be starting from scratch in either case. The dev container file is just that it's like a script that tells Visual Studio Code what to do. If you started with this C# app like I did in the very beginning and then decided we need to add a SQL Server or a Postgres, it's just modifying that and then doing a rebuild. So essentially demo 2 was a rebuild of the previous one. I just happened to choose the pre-built template. But you could dynamically control that. Like in my sample one here, this was generated, like this part was generated by me. This part was generated by me because I knew what extensions I wanted. And the way you get these extensions are from looking at the marketplace. If you want more on like the file format, you can go to my blog and there's actually a post. I don't know, localhost because it's gone. There's a post, the third one down here, that talks about like more into the dev container format and like how to use it with some samples. Basically, it's a copy of what I just showed you on my dev connections for my blog. And here's some other things you need. All the links I basically showed you are on there. Yes, sir.
Yes, like here they only try to GitHub, right? Getting the containers and all this.
In the last sample, yes, it was tied to GitHub.
Can't we attach it to some third party like Azure or Amazon?
I don't know yet. The question was right now the demo for Codespaces was tied to GitHub. And can we tie it to any other third parties? Rumor has it you can with Azure. I just haven't tried it and done it.
It's almost like GitHub Action where you can connect it to Azure, but here maybe you have this fancy ability to code online or in
Yep.
the browser, right?
Yeah. I would imagine that in the very, very near future. Again, this has only been in beta for like 7 months. Got to imagine that Azure would have its own way of doing Codespaces. I know JetBrains is also working on something where you can kind of use the JetBrains tools to connect to it. Basically, behind the scenes, it's creating a bridge between Visual Studio Code and Docker, like LiveShare does for Visual Studio, or Code, whatever does for Rider. Any others? Cool. Well, thank you for coming. My contact information is here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.